The wind was a constant, gnawing presence on the high plains, carrying dust and the mournful cry of something distant. It was a sound Alara had come to know intimately in the 3 weeks since she'd arrived at the remote ranch, a place of last resort, a place where questions were few but the work was brutal and the silence was as thick as the layer of grit on everything. They had sent her here, away from prying eyes and wagging tongues, after the incident, after the whispers had become shouts, after the life she knew had evaporated like morning mist under the unforgiving sun. She was an inconvenience, a stain, banished to this desolate corner of the territory with little more than the clothes on her back and the heavy burden of shame. The ranch hands kept their distance. Their gazes, when they fell upon her, were either cold indifference or outright contempt. A lone woman, young and clearly out of her element, arriving under such clouded circumstances, was an anomaly here, and anomalies were distrusted, ridiculed, and often broken. She ate alone, worked alone, tending the meager vegetable patch, scrubbing floors that never stayed clean, mending rough linens by the dim light of a single lamp. Her throat felt perpetually closed, not just from the dry air but from the unspoken accusation that hung in the air around her like the persistent dust. There was no one to talk to, even if she had found the will or the words. The foreman, a burly man named Jedediah, spoke only in curt orders or gruff complaints. The other hands were a rough, transient lot, their conversations crude and punctuated by harsh laughter that never included her. Her silence was not entirely forced by others. A part of it was her own doing, a retreat deep inside herself where the memories and the pain could be held captive, away from the judgment of the world. But the silence also felt like a cage, its bars forged from isolation and fear. Her hands, once accustomed to needlepoint and piano keys, were now calloused and cracked, stained with soil and lye soap. Each day was a monotonous cycle of labor, exhaustion, and the gnawing ache of loneliness. She watched the men from a distance, figures against the vast sky, riding out to tend the cattle. Their lives lived in the open, under the sun and wind, while hers was confined to the dusty corners of the ranch house and the small, fenced garden. Among them was one who was different, though she couldn't say exactly why. He was younger than the others, tall and lean, with a quiet intensity about him. He didn't join in the crude jokes or the open stares. His name, she'd heard someone call, was Silas. He worked harder than the rest, it seemed, always the first out, the last in, moving with a quiet efficiency. Sometimes, she felt his eyes on her, not with the judging glare of the others, but something else. Curiosity, perhaps pity, though she recoiled from the thought. Pity was another form of looking down. She preferred the indifference. At least that didn't sting with the reminder of her fallen state. The ranch house was drafty and cold at night, the wind rattling the window panes like skeletal fingers. Sleep offered little true rest, haunted by fragments of the past and the stark reality of her present. She was trapped here, it felt, with no way out, her spirit slowly grinding down under the weight of the world's disapproval and the crushing solitude. The only sound was the wind, and the only company, the silent, watchful prairie. One evening, she found a neatly stacked pile of firewood outside the back door, far more than she'd chopped herself that day. It was a small thing, barely noticeable but deliberate. The next morning, a coil of sturdy rope appeared near the clothesline where the old one had frayed to breaking point. She saw Silas riding back towards the corrals, his back straight, not looking her way. Was it him? There was no acknowledgement, no expectation of thanks. Just the quiet provision of something needed. Her initial suspicion, honed by the cruelties she'd faced, was wary. Why would he? What did he want? But as the days turned into weeks, these small, unsolicited acts of practical kindness continued. A loose board on the porch fixed. A bucket left by the well when hers had gone missing. He never spoke to her, never even seemed to linger. It was as if these were tasks on his endless list, performed with the same silent competence he applied to mending fences or shoeing horses. Slowly, imperceptibly, her rigid fear began to soften, replaced by a tentative, fragile curiosity. She started watching him more closely. While the others congregated at the end of the day, Drinking and gambling, Silas would sit apart, sharpening tools or mending tack, his movements economical and focused. He seemed as solitary in his own way as she was in hers, though his solitude felt chosen, hers imposed. The shared space of the ranch remained vast, but the distance between them seemed to lessen, not through proximity, but through a quiet, unspoken understanding. She learned to anticipate his presence, a silent anchor in her day. He never offered a smile, never initiated a greeting, yet his actions spoke a language she was beginning to comprehend, a language of observation, capability, and perhaps a quiet respect for survival. The foreman, Jedediah, grew bolder in his unpleasantness. His comments were laced with insinuation, his gaze lingering in a way that made her skin crawl. The other men sometimes echoed his tone, emboldened by his example. Fear would coil in her stomach, but she had learned to keep her face impassive, her eyes downcast, a practiced mask of submission. One afternoon, Jedediah blocked her path as she carried water from the well, his bulk imposing, his voice low and sneering. "Still ain't said boo, have ya? Cat got your tongue? Or maybe something else left you speechless?" He chuckled, a wet, ugly sound, and reached out a hand towards her arm. Before his fingers could touch her, a shadow fell over them. Silas was standing there, seemingly having appeared out of nowhere, holding a heavy saddle blanket he was taking to the tack room. He didn't speak. He didn't make a move. He simply stood, his eyes usually quiet, holding a steady, unwavering intensity as they met Jedediah's. The foreman's grin faltered. He hesitated for a moment, the air crackling with unspoken challenge, then grunted and stepped aside, muttering under his breath. Silas didn't look at her as he continued on his way, but his presence, his silent intervention, had been a shield. A wave of something unfamiliar washed over her. Not just relief, but a fragile sense of protection, a feeling she hadn't experienced in a long time. The world hadn't entirely abandoned her to the wolves. There was one person, this quiet, competent stranger, who seemed to see her, not as a pariah, but as a person enduring. The incident with Jedediah shifted something subtle in the atmosphere. Jedediah's hostility didn't vanish, but it became more guarded. The other men seemed less inclined to openly mock her, perhaps wary of Silas's quiet disapproval. And between Alara and Silas, the silence began to feel less like a barrier and more like a shared space. She no longer flinched when he was near. She even found herself occasionally meeting his gaze, a brief, acknowledging look before returning to her work. One cold, clear morning, a harsh wind whipped across the prairie, promising an early bite of winter. The water pump was frozen solid. Alara tried everything she could think of, pouring warm water from the kettle, but the ice held fast. Panic began to set in. Water was life on this ranch. She saw Silas walking towards the pump house, his breath pluming in the frigid air. He knelt, examining the frozen mechanism, then went back towards the barn. He returned shortly with a blowtorch, a tool she'd only seen used for mending metal, and a thick canvas tarp. He carefully draped the tarp around the pump, creating a small, sheltered space, then, with precise, controlled movements, applied the flame to the critical parts, melting the ice slowly, coaxing the pump back to life. Alara watched, mesmerized by his focused determination and competence. When the pump finally groaned and then gushed water, he turned it off, packed his tools, and made to leave. It was then, standing in the biting wind, the steam rising from the thawed pump, that she found her voice. It was a rusty sound, barely a whisper, and used for so long. "Thank you," she managed to say, the word feeling foreign on her tongue. He stopped, his back still to her. He didn't turn around, but he inclined his head slightly. That was all. No words, no grand gesture, just a simple acknowledgement. But for Alara it was monumental. It was the first voluntary word she had spoken to anyone here, the first step out of the enforced quiet. Over the next few weeks, as the weather grew harsher, the small acts of connection continued. He left extra firewood by her door, already split into manageable pieces. He showed her how to wrap the water pipes to prevent freezing. She, in turn, started leaving a cup of hot tea on the porch railing for him when he came in from the bitter cold late at night. He never commented, but the cup was always empty by morning. The unspoken dialogue between them grew, a language of small gestures and shared resilience against the elements and the harshness of their lives. There was a quiet strength about him that she found herself leaning on, not in dependence, but in shared existence. She began to feel a faint stirring of her own buried strength. She was surviving, despite everything, despite them, despite the past. She was still here, still working, still finding a way. And she wasn't entirely alone anymore. The fragile peace of their quiet understanding was shattered one afternoon when Jedediah, fueled by whiskey and a petty grievance about lost cattle, cornered Alara in the barn. His face was red, his eyes hard, the veneer of guardedness gone. He advanced on her, spitting accusations and crude insults, his voice loud enough to carry. "Thought you were too good for the likes of us, did ya? Always silent, always looking down your nose. Well, maybe it's time someone taught you your place." He grabbed her arm roughly, his grip like iron, jerking her towards him. Fear, sharp and primal, seized her. She struggled, but his strength was overpowering. Just as she cried out, a blur of movement at the edge of her vision. Silas. He didn't say a word. He simply moved with lightning speed, placing himself between them. He didn't throw a punch. Instead, he used his body, positioning himself squarely, a solid, immovable obstacle. Jedediah, startled and enraged, lunged forward. Silas met him not with force, but with leverage, sidestepping slightly and using Jedediah's own momentum against him, guiding the larger man past him with a controlled push. Jedediah stumbled, sprawling face-first into a pile of hay. He roared curses as he scrambled to his feet, but Silas stood his ground, his posture alert, his eyes fixed on the foreman with an intensity that brooked no argument. The other ranch hands, drawn by the commotion, started to gather, watching. The unspoken tension was thick. Silas didn't speak, but his message was clear. She was under his protection. Jedediah, seeing the silent, unified front Silas presented, backed down, muttering threats as he stalked away, brushing hay from his clothes. The men dispersed, the moment passing, but the air had changed. Alara stood trembling, her arm throbbing where Jedediah had held her. Silas turned to her then, his expression unreadable for a moment, before his gaze softened almost imperceptibly. He still didn't speak, but he gave a small, decisive nod, a silent acknowledgement of her distress and his intervention. In that moment, the last vestiges of her forced silence crumbled. The fear was still there, but something else had risen alongside it. A fierce surge of gratitude and, unexpectedly, strength. She looked at Silas, at his quiet resolve, and knew she couldn't hide anymore. She had to stand for herself. The next morning, she sought out Jedediah. He was nursing a bruised ego and a sore head. She approached him not with fear, but with a quiet dignity she hadn't known she possessed. "What happened yesterday will not happen again," she said, her voice steady despite a tremor in her hands. It wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of her rediscovered voice. Jedediah scoffed, but there was a flicker of surprise in his eyes. She didn't wait for a response. She turned and walked away, her back straight. She wasn't the same broken woman who had arrived weeks ago. The harsh land, the solitude, and the quiet protection of a stranger had forged something new within her. Later, she found Silas mending a fence. She stopped a few feet away. "Thank you," she said again, more clearly this time. He looked up, a rare, fleeting expression crossing his face, not a smile, but something akin to understanding, perhaps even respect. "You stood tall," he said, his voice low and calm, the first words she had ever heard him speak directly to her that weren't related to a task. Against the wind, his words were simple, but they resonated deeply. She had been buffeted by the wind, by the cruelty of others, but she had not broken. And in finding her voice, she had found her footing. The ranch remained a harsh place, the future uncertain. But as she stood there, the vast prairie stretching before her, she knew she would face it not alone, but with a quiet strength born of resilience and the silent bond forged in hardship with the most unexpected of allies. Resilience is not the absence of pain, but the ability to rise through it, step by step, breath by breath. She had arrived on this desolate land stripped bare of reputation, of hope, of voice. The world had cast her out, leaving her to the silence and the judgment of the wind and the unyielding earth. For weeks, she had existed within that silence, a ghost moving through a life that was not her own, the heavy cloak of shame and fear rendering her mute. But the prairie, in its stark and brutal honesty, demanded something else. It demanded presence, endurance, a quiet strength that mirrored its own. And in the silent presence of a man who asked for nothing and offered only quiet, capable aid, she had found a reflection of that strength, a flicker of unexpected kindness in the vast indifference. He had not offered platitudes or pity, only the steady assurance of his competence and a willingness to stand, silently, between her and the cruelties of the world. His actions, more eloquent than any words, had chipped away at the walls she had built around her heart, allowing a fragile seed of trust to take root. And in that fertile ground, watered by shared hardship and moments of quiet understanding, her own buried strength began to push through. The voice that had been silenced by shock and shame did not return in a sudden, dramatic flourish, but tentatively, a whispered thank you, then a steady declaration, a reclaiming of self. She had found her voice not by being given permission, but by finding the internal fortitude to take it back. The ranch remained a place of struggle, the elements unforgiving, the people wary. But she was no longer the same woman. The vulnerability remained, a reminder of the past, but it was now tempered by a hard-won resilience. She had faced the storm, literal and figurative, and found that she possessed the capacity to weather it. And in Silas, she had found not a savior, but a partner in endurance, a quiet alliance forged in shared silence and mutual respect. The future was not a guaranteed path of ease, but looking out at the vast, challenging landscape, Alara felt a sense of quiet determination she had never known before. She had faced the worst and survived. She had found her voice where she had been forced into silence. And in the vastness of the prairie, she was no longer lost, but standing tall, ready to face whatever came next, not as a victim, but as a woman who had found her strength in the most unlikely of places, with the most unexpected of companions. The wind still blew, but now, she felt she could finally stand against it.